Okay, so welcome back to the Get Out of Your Comfort Zone interview series, where we engage thought leaders about the challenges that they have had in stepping outside their comfort zones in their lives, and also advice that they might have for the rest of us around stepping outside your comfort zone, and also leadership for young people. I'm Andy Molinsky, and today we have a very special guest, Stu Friedman. Stu is an award-winning teacher, writer, radio host, and is also the founding director of Wharton's Work-Life Integration Project. He's been recognized twice as one of HR's most influential international thinkers and is one of the world's top 50 business thinkers 3 times by Thinkers 50. He has many, many achievements, including a recent book called Leading the Life You Want, Skills for Integrating Work and Life with Harvard Business Review Press, 2014, which was a Wall Street Journal bestseller, which also builds on his award-winning best-selling book, Total Leadership, How to Be a Better Leader, Have a Richer Life, which has been translated into many different languages. He hosts a radio show interviewing CEOs, scholars, practitioners, students, and others about very useful information for creating harmony among different parts of your life. And that's on Wharton Business Radio, Sirius XM Live at Tuesday at 7 p.m., but also on a free podcast at workandlifepodcast.com. So welcome very much, Stu. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me, Andy. It's great to be here.
Great. So I wanted to start with our first question, and I explained this to you before, and I think it's a really interesting question because I think people really like to understand others' experience acting outside their comfort zone, what it was like, what they might have struggled with, and how they were able to overcome or address those challenges. And so I pose that question to you. Can you think of a time in your professional career where, it could even be your life as well, but your professional career where you've had to step outside your comfort zone?
I think the best example of that for me was when in 1999, the CEO of Ford Motor Company asked me to join his management team to be the head of leadership development for Ford on a global basis. So I had done a dissertation at the University of Michigan in the early 80s on how large companies select and develop their top executive talent. And I spent a good chunk of the 80s doing research and working with companies on their talent management systems. I founded the Wharton Leadership Program for our MBAs and our undergrads in the early 90s, 1991. And as you mentioned, the Work-Life Integration Project. And was working with companies as a consultant on both of these topics, but I had never held an executive role in a big company. I had run a lot of teams and had a lot of supervisory experience, but I was never a senior executive reporting to an officer of the Ford Motor Company. And all of a sudden, I was. So in 1999, after 15 years as a professor at Wharton, I took a leave. For 2.5 years, my family moved with me back to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where my wife and I were both graduate students many years prior. And now I'm there as a fat cat senior executive, with a big house and all the Ford cars and everything, and the kids are in private schools. And it's a very different situation than when I was a graduate student in an 800 square foot working class home that we purchased in 1981 for $36,000. Anyway, the important point about being out of my comfort zone was to step into an executive role, which was, while I had worked with many, many executives as a consultant and coach, I had not been in that role, and that was a huge stretch for me on many dimensions.
So that's really interesting. I imagine there's also the challenge of going from the academic culture to the corporate culture, not just consulting in it, but living in it. What were a few of the sort of eye-openers, either about moving from an academic world and culture to a corporate world and culture, or from a sort of professor role to an executive role? I'd be curious.
There were so many. And, I remember vividly those early days, the first couple months especially, when I would, at the end of a long workday, get into my car and drive from Dearborn back to Ann Arbor for that 45 minutes, and my head felt like it was going to explode because I was so overwhelmed with the amount of information coming at me and the amount of complexity of the decisions I was having to take. And so one of the things that was just radically different in that role was the need for speed and also to learn how to delegate. Both of which I had some sense of before, but nothing like what was coming at me in this new role. Having to hire and develop a whole new team, developing a vision for what leadership development at Ford Motor Company on a global basis could be, should be, and sharing that vision, getting other people to buy into it. And really working with so many different stakeholders internally and externally to get their commitment, to strive to get their commitment. It was a very difficult learning process because I made a lot of big mistakes going in, and so the first 6 months to a year was an extremely steep learning curve, and so I think critical among those was learning how to take energy and information and ideas that were coming at me and distributing the responsibility for not only responding intelligently to those opportunities and challenges, but figuring out to whom I could entrust responsibility for those instead. So that was a major learning. And I think the other big one was about the politics of organizational life from the inside and how crucial it was to always be speaking in terms of the collective interest, which was, I thought I was doing, but I wasn't. I thought I was speaking in terms of what we were going to need to do together to create an organization that had the capacity to develop the best leaders in the world. But I often came across as speaking really only about my own aspirations and interests. And that was, without knowing it, inadvertently, until, pretty quickly I got feedback from people around me who helped me to realize what I was doing and what I needed to do to course correct.
That's interesting. In these situations, in terms of delegation was one example. Changing the way you speak about your ambitions and activities and so on in terms of the collective. So I guess one question that I would have, which is in this situation outside your comfort zone, kind of getting to that point.
Yeah.
Were these things that were simply new and unexpected, or were they things that any aspects of them that kind of ran counter to your personality or habitual ways, so that it wasn't just the aha experiences, oh, I have to do that, but it was actually, whoa, I've got to change that part of myself?
It's a great question. I think it was some of both. One of the biases that I think is pretty pervasive in the academic world is that practitioners aren't as smart as we are. I'm sort of laughing at that, laughing at myself, really, but and perhaps you know what I'm speaking of. There's a sense that, those of us who operate in the rarefied world of ideas, don't get our hands dirty because we're smarter than that. And what I soon discovered, very quickly discovered, was that the people I was surrounded by in the executive ranks and throughout the organization were passionate, committed, so many brilliant minds, but devoted to a different sort of task, which was getting stuff done and moving an organization forward in a way that was, both productive, competitive, and striving to be compassionate. And how difficult that work is. It's so much harder than it looks. And so I was rapidly humbled by the strength and capacities of the people surrounding me, particularly those who were in the officer corps. So there were about 35 officers, and then about 300 of us in the executive level, and then another 300,000 worldwide. And I was just really surprised at how bright and forceful the thinking was of those I was surrounded by. I had not expected that, and I had this bias, which was rapidly being dispelled by my experience as I learned, wow, these people are way smarter than me about things that I had never even really thought about, like how to move with speed in a way that is not reckless, and how to engage other people by sharing your point of view in a way that they see as useful for them as well as for you. I mean, so many important lessons from people who I would otherwise have not taken as seriously, I have to admit.
So it sounds
but
like...
I was deeply humbled and came out of that experience with a much greater respect for the people who are in the trenches every day trying to get things done in organizations. And I think that has made me a much more effective, I hope that it's made me a more effective educator, consultant, coach, and scholar.
Yeah, that's a great experience. Almost like it almost sounds like something every academic, who's presented with an opportunity. I mean, it's a unique opportunity, but some form of an opportunity like that should have. So I guess one last question I would have about that experience is so. I mean, your expectations seem to be different from the reality. You started to realize you needed to delegate. You started to realize that your impressions of these folks were different from what they were, and furthermore, that there were some challenges like the speed element that you just hadn't really fully considered. How did you change or pivot or whatever the word might be? Like, how did you, or did you, did you say, okay, I got to change? Like, how did that happen, if it happened, in terms of your mindset, your orientation? You certainly came away learning things, but in the moment, in terms of doing your job, how did you adapt? Did you adapt? Was it hard? I'd just like to hear a little bit about that.
I was surrounded by people who were who I had enlisted to provide feedback and coaching for me. So I was very, very lucky. I had a lot of people who knew that this was a stretch assignment for me in a very big way. In addition to managing the dynamics of moving my family for the first time. This is something that they were unaccustomed to. So, I had support. I had, colleagues at Ford. I had external coaches, and I really did try to create an environment in which there was feedback coming at me on a pretty regular basis, so that I couldn't help but be learning, because the intensivity of the feedback was high. I would say that the way that I tried to adapt was to surround myself as much as possible with people who were willing to tell me how I was messing up and what I needed to do differently, as well as what was working. And so that was essential, was to be in a feedback-rich environment, and it was.
And I guess to have a real sort of to have the ability to step back and make sense of your experience from a sort of a learning orientation in real time, which sounds like it might be hard for anyone in that situation, but that support that you had sounds really, I'm just trying to think of lessons for other folks who might not be able to have multiple consultants, helping them in the process, like a senior executive assignee might, but are there any suggestions for others, in this type of circumstance?
Well, sure, and this is something that I teach and coach people about and have now for decades. Anyone can create a feedback-rich environment for themselves by enlisting coaches, and that's with a small c. It doesn't have to be a formal relationship or somebody that you pay, for their services, but somebody who is interested in your growth.
Yeah.
And you'd be surprised at how many people. I mean, even if you're just a 20-year-old, college junior, there's a lot of people who want you to succeed, want you to grow, and are willing to help. The difficult thing is asking for that help and helping the people who might be helping you see how it's in their interest to do that. So one thing I find often, especially with younger people, undergrads as well as MBA students, and even our executive MBA students, is that you have a lot to offer people who are older than you, who are senior to you in their careers, because you have a perspective on life and on the business world or wherever you are operating that they don't have. So, so you can offer that to them and look for ways to be helpful to them while they're helping you. That is an important aspect of building networks of support over the course of your whole life, looking for ways to help others and for them to help them help you. And of course, as you grow older and you get a lot of gray hair, you start to feel, a sense of gratitude for the opportunities you've had, and you try to spend as much of your time and energy on helping others, younger people, to come up in the world. And it's a really good feeling to have the opportunity to do that. So there are ways in which young people can enlist others, particularly older people, who want to help them, because it feels good for them to be helping younger people come up, especially to help them avoid the mistakes that they made, but also to connect them to resources in the wider world. So I'm really glad you asked that, because I think it's such an important aspect of developing leadership capacity at any life stage, surrounding yourself with people who care about you as a person and as someone who can contribute to the world in some positive way. And the more you can be presenting yourself as, here's what I want to be doing with my life, with my work, that is not just about my own self-aggrandizement and enrichment, but how I'm going to use my talents, my passions, my interests to make the world better in some way, and I'd like your help with that. If you represent your interests honestly, genuinely, as serving some larger interests, whatever that is, you're much more likely to get help from other people, and you're probably going to be less inhibited about asking for it, because you won't be asking in a purely selfish way. You'll be asking for help to be able to be stronger, to make your unique contribution.
So that's a great segue. In fact, the last question I was going to ask you is there are a lot of people, I think, who'll be listening to this who are young and maybe strive to become a leader ultimately. But as a 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old, what can you do to set yourself up for future leadership opportunities? This sounds like a great strategy, creating that sort of fabric of mentorship, and in that specific tip you mentioned about trying to understand the ultimate goal or impact that you want to achieve as making a difference in the world, communicating that, and that will not only increase the chances that someone else will help you, but also make you feel more comfortable about asking. I love that.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you might advise young people to do?
Well, there's lots. I write in the Total Leadership book, which is really the story of my course that I teach at Wharton and is now being taught all over the world. I've taught it in a massive open online course and in virtual workshops and such. It's got tons of examples in there of things that one can do at any life stage, but it begins with being real. Clarifying what matters most to you. So there's a set of exercises there that you can do as an undergrad or as a retired person that has to do with, first and foremost, and this comes from our research and what many others, including you and so many other people have come to know as essential for growth as a leader and creating harmony among the different parts of your life, it starts with clarifying who you are, what's most important to you, what are your values, your beliefs, and your vision of the world you want to try to create. So one of the most useful exercises is to write about the future that you imagine today. And a fruitful way of doing that is to take a long enough time horizon so that it's not an action plan that you're creating, but a vision, a picture, a compelling image of an achievable future that's out there 15 years out. So if you're 20, imagine you're 35 and describe a day in your life. In the morning, what do you do? In the afternoon, what do you do? In the evening, what are you doing? And most importantly, write about why you're doing what you're doing, the impact you're having, and the legacy you're creating. And that is a really useful exercise, not because it creates an action plan so much as it helps you to project into the future with your imagination what it is that you care about today. So that's one of the important exercises that I ask people to do to get clearer and to be candid with yourself, most of all, about what you really care about. And of course, that may change. It probably will change. If you're 20, your aspirations are going to be very different, most likely when you're 35 or when you're 50 or when you're 65, like me. The world looks a lot different, and your aspirations shift. Your values change. Life experiences change you. People are born, people die, people come and go, opportunities arise, they fail. So you're constantly looking at what matters most. That's just one exercise for doing that. There's others. But the place to start is to be talking, writing, thinking, sharing with trusted colleagues, friends, family. Here's what I'm thinking about. Here's why. And if you can tie that back to your history, so another important set of exercises has to do with describing the critical episodes in your life history that have shaped your values and beliefs and how they shaped you. That's your leadership story as it is evolving. Where have you come from, literally? How has that turned you into the person you are now? And where is it that you now want to go based on where you've come from? And the more you write about that, talk about it, get feedback on it, have people ask you inquiring, curious, questions that help you to articulate what's important to you and where you want to go, the clearer you're going to become, the more confident you're going to become, and the more you're going to see ways in which you can actually move towards that. So I would start with that.
That's great. And it's I like that that's something that any young person can do. So that's a really, really, really great tip.
And you start with that. I'll just add very briefly.
Yeah.
The first piece is to be real with yourself. The second piece is to be whole and recognize that you've got these different parts of your life, not just your career, but you may well have interests in family, friends, and other community interests, your role as a citizen, and then your own personal health and well-being and spiritual growth. How do all those pieces fit together? Who are the people that you want to inhabit your world? So, starting from knowing as clear as you can what matters most to you, and then extending out into the social landscape that you want to be cultivating and navigating, that's when you start to think about, well, who in that realm of social experiences is going to be helping me? And who am I going to be helping? And to start to be clear about, what your social world looks like and how to cultivate connections and contribute to people so that they're in the long run going to want to contribute to you. That is your social capital investment strategy. And that's a big part of what I address in the middle part of the book. Who are your stakeholders? Who do they need to be? How do you cultivate those relationships over time?
So if folks want to learn more about this, where can they go? This seems like very, very useful information.
Yeah, well, I have tried to be someone who brings useful ideas from research into the practical world of everyday life for people who want to grow as leaders and create harmony among the different parts of their lives. TotalLeadership.org is a place where you can learn a lot about what this model is about and how it works. Also, Work and Life podcast.com is where you can get free copies of the podcast. And at the Wharton School, the Work-Life Integration Project is that you can just Google Wharton Work Life and find out about our research and practice and social advocacy that we've been doing since 1991.
Well, this is great. Really, thoughtful insight, some real interesting stories, and immediately actionable tips. So I really appreciate your coming on and sharing this with us.
Andy, I appreciate what you're doing with the great work at Brandeis in your scholarship and bringing ideas for action to the world. So it's a privilege to be speaking with you about these things today, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.